On this episode of the show, I have with me Davy Li. He is head of engineering at Mesa, and we're going to be talking about team building. And we're actually going to cover a few topics in this area about moving into head of engineering role. And Davy's going to share his experiences with us, modeling how you'd like the engineering org to look. And also, you got to give good engineers some space. We're going to talk about non-traditional backgrounds and ask him how he's been upskilling himself as he's been progressing through the various levels of management. Davy, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Excited to chat.
Absolutely. Before we start, why don't you tell everyone what Mesa does?
Yeah, so the mission of Mesa is to make home ownership more affordable and rewarding. And we're building a product that gives homeowners value back for every dollar that they spend on their homes via credit card style benefits and rewards. We have a couple of products live right now, actually. The main one being the Mesa Homeowners credit card. And it's a product where members can earn points on their monthly mortgage payments and also bonus points on just any home related spend, such as like utilities, like HOAs, or sure people make a lot of runs to home improvement stores as well. We also have the mortgage marketplace where our members can earn 1 point per dollar on the principal of the mortgage. So it's essentially that means a $1 million home is 1 million points that can be redeemed or transferred to our partners.
All right, so we're going to be diving into talking about building engineering teams specifically. So this topic came about. We were talking about your background, your journey into management, and obviously you've moved into a head of engineering role in the last year or so. And I guess just to start off, as you've kind of gone through various levels of management, your last role was a EM title. You moved into head of engineering. What has changed for you what has changed for you?
Yeah, so just to give a bit of context for my background, I've spent a good amount of time in like what I call like big tech companies. And right now at Mesa, we're fairly small. We're around 20 people. So they're very different types of problems that we solve in the very different types of size of companies. So at the big tech companies that I was at, really there was a lot more about stakeholder management and also just making sure that my team was aligned and we're building the correct things and understanding the context of everything that is going on in my organization. Whereas right now in a startup, it is really still that there's a lot going on, but then also a lot more hands-on type of work as well. And when I started at Mesa, where we didn't have anyone on the engineering team yet, having the opportunity to really build it from scratch was definitely a really exciting opportunity for me, but also a little bit scary at the same time. And I kind of started by just thinking about what are some of the best cultural values and the best ways that the places I have been working at and being able to take those things to Mesa. So even before like hiring people, really sat down to think about those cultural values. And we have 4 right now. It's always iterating and growing. But the 4 that we have, one of them is trust by default. We really do trust that every single person on the engineering team like has the best intent for the company and they're making the best decisions given the information that they have at the time. The second one is around transparent communication. We really all make the best decisions like when we have the full context around what's going on in the product and the business. And when people don't have that, like we really encourage people to go out and seek it. And kind of where this one really came about is at big tech companies, teams are really oriented around one particular key metric or a KPI. And it's really helpful, but it's almost I would think of it as like lossy compression of what is the true story of what the business is trying to optimize for. And having the full context is like super helpful. The third one is one of my favorites actually is simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. I'm sure everyone has been at companies and in teams where there are products and systems that are overly designed. And when something goes wrong, it just becomes really difficult to debug, or if you need to rewrite and refactor, almost scary to touch because you don't know how things really work. And one of the things I really encourage my team to do is like, what is this simplest possible solution? What are the things that will take us about half the time, but get us like 80% of the way there? And this ultimately does allow us to move faster because we're not trying to solve for the 20% edge case by spending 80% of our time on those things. And the last one, which I really, of course, believe in as well, is like bias towards action. We gain just a far more information by doing things and gathering feedback than just sitting around and deliberating and hypothesizing what's happening. There were definitely cases in some companies I was at where just like writing down documentation, having meetings, and sharing things where the best and the most, the quickest way to get that feedback is just by trying it out and you know if it works or not. And so we really do try to practice that. I think the exception here are one-way doors, meaning decisions that you make where it's really hard to revert back. But those are, in my experience, really far and few between. And just anything that people are excited about and want to try, we should just go ahead and do it.
Absolutely. I'm glad you talked about, obviously, different companies, different scale of businesses, and obviously different size of teams. When you look at the companies you've been at, obviously, you mentioned your 20-person company now. You're probably responsible. There's maybe for a little bit more decision making. There's a dotted line to the C-suite. Some of those things, different stakeholders. I guess just from the stakeholder perspective, you're a much shorter path to the CTO, the CEO, versus at a company that has a few thousand employees. Does that change anything for you as an engineering leader?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. There is definitely a lot more of like truly needing to understand what the business is and like how the P&L works, how we make money. Not to say that isn't important in a big company, but one of the things I've always heard when trying to get recruited to big companies is like we operate like a startup, but really it's really not the same. It is really not the same no matter how small a team may operate in a big company, because the team may die, but the company will survive. And you don't always have to fully understand like how everything works, and it's okay. Not to say that it's not the best way, but at a startup, really understanding the business, understanding how to be more external is also a really big skill set that I've had to learn. Meaning that I'm not just being external within the company, where in big tech is like you just have 20 different teams that you talk to build one product. But here it's like we have a lot of different partners, different banking partners, and different parts of this tech stack. Whereas we have to work with all of them, and you have to be better at being an external partner to the company. Whereas there isn't as much of that type of skill set in big tech.
If you're, let's say, an EM, you're a director at a larger tech firm, there's processes established. There's, you're stepping into a role where, unless it's a brand new team, even if it's a brand new team, there's still a lot of processes and policies in place. Joining a company that's smaller, younger, I guess you get a chance to kind of shape some of that, right? You're working with the CTO. He's probably the co-founder. You've been brought in to lead, be it head of engineering. When you start thinking about, and I mean, you've been there a year, so it's not like you're starting. You thought about this past tense. When you were thinking about how you'd like to model what the engineering org would look like, how did you start? What was the thought process at the time?
Yeah, so one is, of course, just the cultural values that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And the second aspect is like me just reflecting on what was some of the best engineering teams I've worked in and what were those attributes. And I would say it really boils down to about two. So one of them is A players, just working with really, really good people. As soon as you bring on A players, like A players bring on more A players. The other thing is the ownership that engineers had, where they understand the business and the product context, and they're just given in a certain amount of reign to do what they think is best. And that just allows like the speed that the team can operate in to be really, really quick. Just a couple examples here is like one, we have an engineer who's like, actually, sorry, just to back up a little bit. And I would say a third thing is actually we have a small team, and I knew that it was going to be a really small team to begin with. And I think about building the teams in terms of what I call like champions in the team. So particular engineers who are really strong in one domain, and they're able to bring up the rest of the team as well. And so we have people that are really strong in infrastructure, really strong on the mobile development side, on web, and all of these people are able to kind of be the champion for that particular part of our engineering stack, be able to bring the rest of the team up with them, and also to make sure that we have the best practices around those things as well.
No, I like that. That's a great explanation. When you talk about, and you mentioned to me, giving good engineers the space, to do their best work, I guess talk to us a little bit about that, because if you're at a startup, that means one thing, and we'll talk about it in the context of a startup of how do you give a good engineer enough space to do that best work.
Yeah. So I think some of the best engineers I've always worked with are the ones that comes to me often for what are the improvements or things that we should be doing in the company or in the team. And oftentimes they'll have some ideas, and given the right direction and the right prioritization, I give them the space of like, okay, I want you to do this. Like, let's figure out what is a time box that we should have, and what are the things that what is the time box that we have, and how does this really benefit the business? And I think the best engineers really do understand when it's sometimes not the best time to do something, even though it is technically correct or technically more optimal. Another way that I do this is I really encourage engineers to go and talk to our product manager, to talk to our CEO, to our CTO, and our business partners too, to understand like what are some of the problems, some of the pain points that they have. I really try to get out of the way of being this bottleneck, of being the mediator of conversation, and get them to go talk to our stakeholders. And they'll often come back with like really great ideas that we can go and build out we'll often come back with really great ideas that we can go out and build and test for that. If it were to come through me, they will not always be the best ideas.
That makes sense. And I think as you kind of have been talking about, obviously I know the core values are very important. Do you draw, and obviously you've worked at rather large companies previous, do you draw, or are there things that you looked back as you were starting as in a head of engineering role, and were you like, I can draw some of these intangibles from a Spotify, a Cash App? Like, were you like able to draw on some of those? I know the scale's different, but were there things you were able to borrow?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. So one of the values at Cash App that I really enjoyed was that trust by default. A very small thing that they've done is just auto approve pull requests by default, and it's such a small thing, which at Spotify, transparently, I did not have. And that just allowed engineers to move much faster. And the premise of this is like, we trust that you will address the comments or reach out or make any changes that you need, instead of having to block you from making those changes and merge them in, and then like being kind of like the barrier to actually ship things. That's one really big one. Another aspect I really liked about really both companies is giving an engineer more. One of the things that I really liked about both companies is that giving responsibility for one engineer to what they call the DRI, so the directly responsible individual, the ownership of everything around the project. So this becomes this mix of this tech lead and project management role, but this allows almost unilateral visibility about everything that is going on, which really unblocks the speed of things instead of having multiple people in the room making a decision. And I would say the third thing, which I really believe in as well, is just continuing to push engineers. The third thing that I really believe in is to give more opportunities for engineers that you see are successful and really push them to the boundaries. And I think the best way is giving them projects that are greater in scope, greater in ambiguity. And by scope, it means just talking to more and more stakeholders. More ambiguity here means um, the problem is often not super clear, and needing to understand the business and the product question that we're trying to solve to actually figure out what it is that we have to build. And it is very different, I think, from really early stage engineers where they take a ticket, they implement exactly what it is, and they're done. Whereas the engineers here we're looking for are really self-driven in this way, where they're not just robots, or I guess what AI agents would do these days, and just go and take a task and implement it, but really understand the technology and the implementation as a means to an end of how it is solving a particular product or business problem.
Fantastic. I guess, as you've kind of gone through various levels of management, I understand, head of engineering at a startup is different, context than engineering manager at a cash app or something like that. But as you mentioned, you got to interface with different stakeholders. There's certain different responsibilities. I guess, how do you deal with that change, like in terms of making sure you're addressing any skill gaps in your management background, or any mentorship you might need? I mean, are those things that have typically helped you, or and some people are just like, what, it's trial by fire. I just dive right in and I sink or swim, and I tend to I tend to swim more than sink.
Yeah, I'm definitely someone that just prefers to dive right in and figure out where the gaps are myself. I think one of the ways I've always grown personally is actually listening to podcasts like this, by listening to how other leaders in this space operate. Of course, reading a lot of books as well, reading a lot of books as well, and understanding how the kind of quote unquote the great ones in the industry operate, and taking those learnings over to here. And sometimes I just really think about kind of like from first principles, like what are the things we're trying to do, and just experiment with new processes that I've personally never done, or the company's never done, or anyone has ever done, and just see how it works. Kind of goes back to this bias for action. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, that's totally fine, and we can just try this out. I think this applies to just anything technical or not technical too. Yeah.
I like that, because I think, it's actually funny. I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and they mentioned that part of the way that they learn best is by actually finding that gap and just charging ahead. And obviously you have to be in the right environment. So if you're not in an environment that supports that, that's not going to align to how you perform as well. When you look at the people on your team, is that something that you promote, people to kind of dive in and learn things as they need, and kind of is that something that extends from you to the team in terms of how your philosophy there?
Yeah, I think there's two things I want to talk about here. One is this psychological safety in the team and in the company, that doing something and it failed is really good. That means you tried something and you got information. It is not considered a failure. And the other aspect is most of the team hasn't worked on many parts of the stack. It's often a pretty rare opportunity for engineers to really build things from 0 to 1 truly. And some of the people have never worked in fintech before, but that's fine. And there are people that have. And so people are not kind of forced or encouraged to stay within the lane that they're comfortable with. We're really encourage people to cross lanes, and someone that hasn't worked on mobile before are now mobile experts, or someone that hasn't worked on data pipelines now has someone that they can lean to, who is going back to that champion type of model that they can go to as what are the best practices, and how should I upskill myself. And when it comes to planning, it's making sure there's no silos, that everyone is really working across everything. So of course, we're only 7 people on the engineering team right now, which is fairly small. And when one person is out on vacation, it definitely has a big impact. And so it is kind of intrinsic to a startup that there is no one silo or one domain expert that has all the knowledge of everything, and almost like forcing everyone to share things and really encouraging that, especially just again going back to the psychological safety, right? Like if you don't feel that you can fail and failure is seen as something bad, people don't want to try new things and people will stay within their lanes. And at a startup, it is just growth mode on steroids. And like everything, it has to be around that. And the fastest way to grow is just try a lot of things. And the fastest way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas to figure out which one is actually good.
I believe in that philosophy,
Yeah.
so that completely resonates with me. I was going to ask you something. I haven't. It wasn't on the list of stuff I wanted to cover, but you made me think about this. You know, you did move from an EM role, a larger company. We've talked about it, to head of engineering at a startup. The responsibilities are different. Are you finding I mean, I'm sure you're still involved in code, right? I'm not going to say that you've been removed from it, but are you further removed than you were before, or are you more hands-on now?
Oh, I would say I'm definitely more hands-on now. In a big company, I think it's like honestly shifted a little bit in the industry most recently, where engineering leaders are a lot more hands-on than they used to be. Right now, like is anyone who is like an engineering leader, I've seen them be a lot actually being in the code. Um, I think it's like different degrees of it. It's not to say I have to understand like how every single line of the code works, but it does require me to understand how every part of the system works and how everything interacts with each other. So when we're talking to partners about just brainstorming how to integrate with them, I can actually be productive and not always have to pull like someone else in. When it comes to like the nitty gritty implementation, of course, like the engineers on the team can definitely do it much faster than me, which is great. I think it would actually be a failure on my part if I was the best engineer on the team. Every engineer I think is much better than I am. And I am very happy with that. Kind of goes, yeah, I think just a really side thing here is one other aspect that has been different is like hiring, where big tech companies, you have the name and recognition and everyone knows like, oh, let's apply to a Spotify and a Block and you get tons of great applicants. But when I started and we weren't any brand name or anything or known, it's like this cold start problem of how do you actually bring on A players when no one knows about you. Um, Definitely slight tangent here from the question, but I would say there's like two main ways. One is referrals. It is by far one of the best ways to bring on people that you have worked with in the past. You know exactly how they work. You know that you work well with them. And it is just an extremely de-risk way. The first engineer that I brought on was someone that I worked with at Spotify, and we had a great time working together, and he's really killing it here. It's also just like a benefit for him as well, because the scope that he had at big tech compared to here is probably a magnitude different. And it's just given him an opportunity too. And the other aspect of bringing on great people is really, unfortunately, this just brute force, like going through hundreds of candidates, like resumes and interviews, and to find the right person. Not always glorious. There were definitely days going or weeks going through like 30 candidates or something. Um, Definitely exhausting, but it is something I really appreciated that I did not when I was at big tech, where everyone that came through me into the hiring manager chat was just great and just trying to figure out which great engineer I wanted to bring onto the team.
I love that, Davey. That's fantastic. You know, that's actually really great insight, because I do think that does come into play. Yeah, so I appreciate that viewpoint. I was a technical person in my day. I own a recruiting company now, so I completely understand that rub of brand and quality of inbound candidate applicant, 100%. If somebody wants to maybe discuss a particular point of the podcast with you in a little bit more detail, Davey, how can someone reach out to you?
Yeah, I think the best way you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll maybe drop the link in the notes somewhere. Um, I am unfortunately not too much on social media on Twitter or X, I guess they call it. But LinkedIn is probably the best way right now.
Okay, fantastic. Davey, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for joining and sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I really appreciate how Davey walked us through his transition from working at bigger tech companies to a startup, being head of engineering, what he had to do to kind of adjust, bring in some of those intangibles and kind of just dive in and grow. And actually, it seems like he really loves the fact that if people fail, you learn a lot, which I completely I'm on the same page with, and shared a ton of great insights. Talked a little bit about hiring and some of those challenges of not having brand and what he's had to kind of go through. So please share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. I'd appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, leave me a review. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.